What if the only thing left to save you was a name you hadn't spoken yet? In the winter of 1887, under a sky so wide it seemed to hold every dream and every sorrow, a faint cry pierced the silence of a snow-choked prairie. It came from a wooden cabin, small and frail, clinging to the edge of a frozen world. The sound wasn't loud, not like a baby's first shout or a mother's burst of joy. It was soft, thin, like a thread pulled from a heart that had already unraveled too far. The cabin stood alone, its walls weathered gray, trembling against a wind that howled like it had teeth. Snow piled high against the door, sealing the world outside. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of burned logs, sweat, and old straw scattered across the floor. A fire in the hearth had dwindled to a few glowing coals, barely enough to warm the room. Cold slipped through the cracks in the boards, sharp and sly, curling around everything it touched. Lillian sat slumped against a rough wall, her body aching as if it had been broken and pieced back together. In her arms was a newborn baby, so small she seemed more dream than real. The child's warmth was fragile, like a spark caught in a gust. Lillian's hands trembled as she tucked a thin woolen shawl around the baby's tiny face, her fingers stiff with cold and exhaustion. She'd cried hours ago, tears that burned her cheeks raw, but now her eyes were dry, hollowed out by pain. Her blonde hair stuck to her forehead, damp and dark with sweat, and her nightgown clung to her skin, stained with blood and the struggle of birth. The cold sank into her bones, heavy as iron, biting deeper with every breath. She looked down at the baby, her lips tried to form a smile. It came out crooked, heavy like lifting a stone with cracked hands. "You're beautiful," she whispered, her voice so soft it seemed the wind might steal it. She wanted to say more, to promise the child a world that didn't hurt, but the words stayed locked inside her, trapped behind a chest too tight to breathe freely. The room was silent, too silent, pressing against her like a hand she couldn't push away. A sharp scoff broke the quiet, cutting through the air like a blade. Mary, Lillian's mother-in-law, stood across the cabin, her arms crossed tight over her chest. Her face was carved from stone, eyes narrow and cold as the frost outside. She hadn't moved during the birth, hadn't offered a hand or a word, just stood there, watching, waiting for Lillian to prove she was nothing. Now her lips curled, bitter as poison. "A girl," she said, spitting the word like it was dirt. "Another useless mouth to feed. We told you we needed a boy." Lillian didn't look up. She pulled the baby closer, feeling the tiny mouth move against her chest. Searching for milk she wasn't sure she could give. Her heart sank, heavy with doubt, but she held on, shielding the child from Mary's stare. Across the room, Samuel, her husband, sat on a three-legged stool by the window. His boots were crusted with snow, his hands clasped tight between his knees, knuckles pale. He'd come back late, after the worst of her labor was done, slipping into the cabin like a shadow. He hadn't touched the baby, hadn't even looked at her properly. His jaw was locked, his eyes fixed on the floor, as if he could will the moment away. "I did what I could," Lillian said, her voice barely above a breath. "She's your daughter, Samuel." He glanced at her, just for a heartbeat. Something flickered in his face. Pity, maybe, or a ghost of the man he'd been when they'd married. But it vanished, swallowed by a hardness she didn't recognize. He turned back to the window, letting silence speak for him. It hurt more than any shout, more than any curse. Mary stepped closer, her shadow falling over Lillian like a storm cloud. "You failed this family," she said, her voice low and sharp, each word a needle. "You brought shame. A girl means no inheritance, no legacy. Just crying, weakness, and more mouths we can't feed." The fire cracked, spitting a puff of ash into the air like gray dust settling over a grave. Lillian closed her eyes, holding the baby tight, her fingers curling into the shawl. Her body ached in places she didn't know could hurt, her insides hollowed out by the birth, by the weight of their words. She wanted to sleep, to sink into darkness and forget, but their stares kept her awake, pinned her to the wall like a moth under glass. Samuel stood, his boots heavy on the creaking floor. He walked to the door and opened it, letting snow blow in, sharp and wild, swirling across the room like a warning. The wind howled outside, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, hungry and endless. "She can't stay," Mary said, her voice flat, final, like a judge passing sentence. Samuel didn't turn. "She's my wife," he mumbled, but the words were empty, carried no fight. "She gave you a daughter," Mary snapped, her eyes blazing. "We told her what we needed. This is her fault. She's cursed us." Samuel looked at the baby, just once, his eyes lingering for a moment. Something softened in his face. Regret, maybe, or a flicker of fear, but it hardened again, quick as a door slamming shut. "She has to leave," he said, his voice low, like he was speaking to himself. Lillian's breath caught, sharp and cold. "Leave?" she echoed, her voice trembling, thinking the pain had twisted her ears. "You'll take the child and go," Mary said, her eyes unyielding, sharp as the wind outside. "You don't belong here." Lillian laughed, a broken sound that scraped her throat. It wasn't joy. It was disbelief, raw and jagged. "I just gave birth," she said, her voice cracking. "I can barely move." "You're strong enough to talk back," Samuel said, still not looking at her, his hand gripping the doorframe. "You'll manage." "Go where?" Lillian asked, her voice small, almost lost in the wind's howl. "There's nothing out there but snow." Mary shrugged, her face cold as the storm. "Back east. Back to wherever you came from. Doesn't matter." She pointed to the window, where snow fell so thick it buried the world in white. "There's a blizzard," Lillian whispered, clutching the baby tighter, her arms shaking. "We'll die." Samuel said nothing, his silhouette dark against the open door. Mary bent down and placed a small bundle by the threshold, a loaf of bread, half wrapped in rough cloth, no butter, no knife, no kindness. It was a cruel gesture, like tossing scraps through stray. Lillian stared at it, then at them, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Anger, maybe, or a stubborn spark that refused to die. She stood, not with strength, but with a will that burned deeper than pain. Her legs wobbled, her body screamed, but she swaddled the baby. Rose, she'd name her Rose, for the hope of spring, in the shawl, tying it with trembling fingers. Rose stirred, making a soft sound, maybe a cry, maybe a sigh, her warmth a small anchor against Lillian's heart. She stepped toward the door, her boots slipping on the icy floor, and walked into the storm. The snow came up past her ankles, clinging like frostbite, cold so sharp it burned. Her boots were thin, worn from years of hard winters, and her nightgown offered no shield against the wind. She didn't look back. If they saw her stumble, they'd call it proof she was weak, and she wouldn't give them that victory. The wind wasn't just wind. It was alive, roaring, pulling at her hair, stinging her face like 1,000 tiny knives. She followed an old wagon path, its ruts barely visible under the snow, not because it promised safety, but because it was the only thing not swallowed by white. Each step sank deep, the powder dragging at her feet, erasing her tracks as if she'd never existed. Rose stayed quiet, her warmth a fragile pulse against Lillian's chest. She kissed the baby's head, ignoring the pain in her cracked, bleeding lips. The sky was ink black, stars sharp as broken glass, watching her struggle without pity. No sound but her boots crunching and the wind's endless scream. No light but the moon, pale and cold, a witness that offered no help. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time unraveled in the cold, fraying at the edges. Her legs burned, her breath came in shallow gasps, each one stinging her throat. She heard a coyote howl, far off, its cries swallowed by the storm, or maybe it was her mind, desperate for sound beyond her own steps. She thought she saw a light flicker ahead, a warm glow in the distance, but when she blinked, it was gone, lost to the snow. Her knees buckled near a split-rail fence, on land she didn't know, its posts half buried in drifts. She sank into the snow, not giving up, just pausing, her body too heavy to carry. Rose whimpered, a tiny sound that cut through the haze, sharp and real. Lillian pulled her close, tucking the shawl tighter, and hummed a song her mother used to sing, about summer fields, warm evenings, and a home that didn't hurt. The air tasted of pine and ice, bitter on her tongue. Her body felt like it was fading, piece by piece, dissolving into the storm's embrace. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow, steady against the wind's chaos. Lillian lifted her head, barely, her vision blurred. A figure knelt beside her, his face half hidden in the dark, his hair braided tight, dark as night. His coat was lined with fur, his eyes steady, unreadable in the moonlight, but not cold. He didn't speak. She tried to, her voice a broken whisper, but it caught in her throat, lost. He reached out, slow, like calming a frightened deer, and touched her shoulder. The world softened, the stars blurred, the wind fell silent. The last thing she saw was his face, calm and sure, as he lifted her and rose, carrying them toward a warmth she'd stopped believing in, a light she hadn't dared to hope for. Morning came, pale and quiet, light creeping over the prairie like a hand brushing away tears. Smoke rose from a low shelter carved into a sandstone hillside, its walls smoothed by time and wind, curling into the dawn like a prayer no one had to speak. Inside, a fire crackled, filling the air with the scent of cedar, ash, and something deeper, like the earth itself breathing. Lillian lay on a woven mat, wrapped in soft buffalo hides, their warmth sinking into her skin. Her breath was shallow, her cheeks flushed with fever, but she was alive. Rose slept beside her, swaddled in cloth lined with rabbit fur, her tiny chest rising and falling, no longer crying, as if she knew sound was a gift to be saved. Across the room, a man sat cross-legged, watching the fire with eyes as calm as still water. His name was Tala. His braid was thick, dark as a raven's wing, falling over one shoulder. His face held stories, high cheekbones, brows drawn gently together, lips pressed in a line that wasn't a frown, wasn't a smile, just steady. He hadn't planned to find them. He'd been checking traps at dusk, a rhythm he followed without thinking, when he saw strange marks in the snow, small, uneven footsteps, sinking deeper with each step, erratic like someone running from something they couldn't outrun. His horse had caught a faint scent, soft, like milk, too gentle for the wild. He'd followed, heart steady, eyes wary, through the storm's blur, until he found her curled near the fence. Rose clutched tight, her lips blue as dusk, her body sinking into the snow. Now, in the shelter's warmth, he moved carefully, placing a bowl of steaming herbs near her. Chamomile, aspen bark, juniper, their sharp, earthy scent cutting through the smoke. He checked her fever with the back of his hand, gentle, practiced. Still hot, but not worse. That was enough for now. He didn't wake her. Rest, he knew, was where healing began, like roots finding soil after a flood. He sat back, picking up a half-carved wooden figure, a woman with strong hands, and let the fire fill the silence, its crackle a language older than words. Lillian woke slowly, in fragments, like a dream piecing itself together. Warmth touched her first, wrapping her like a blanket she didn't deserve. Then the smell, smoke, cedar, something green, alive, pulling her back to the world. Her eyes opened, heavy, taking in the strange room, clay walls smoothed by careful hands, woven mats and patterns that felt like stories, shadows dancing on the ceiling like memories she hadn't lived. Fear spiked, sharp and quick, her heart thudding. Where was she? Then she saw Rose, lying beside her, alive, wrapped in cloth softer than anything she'd ever sewn, the fur lining it warm and fine. She reached out, trembling, and brushed the baby's cheek, warm, real breathing. Her breath hitched, a sob she held back, afraid it might shatter the moment. A shadow moved, quiet but sure. She looked up, tense, her body braced. Tala sat across the room, watching her, not with pity or threat, but with a strength that felt like a mountain, steady through any storm. "Don't move," he said, his voice low, deep as a river over stones, calm but firm. "You're safe." "Where am I?" she asked, her throat dry, each word a struggle. "In shelter," he said, simple, like it was all she needed to know. She looked at Rose, her hand still on the baby's cheek. "My baby, safe," he said, nodding once, his eyes soft but sure. A tear slipped down her cheek, silent, falling into the hides. She didn't thank him, not yet. Words like that felt too big, too fragile, like they might break if she tried to speak them. He stood, slow, and brought her a carved bowl of broth, steam curling from it like a spirit rising. He set it down gently, stepping back. No pressure, no rush, just space for her to breathe. She took it in shaking hands, sipped it, the warmth spreading through her, slow and kind, like sunlight touching frost. Her eyes closed, holding the feeling, letting it anchor her to this strange, quiet place. Days passed, not counted by clocks or sunsets, but by small, steady things. Firewood burned, bowls emptied, Rose's soft coos growing stronger. Tala didn't ask her name or her story, didn't press for answers she wasn't ready to give. He brought water in a clay jug, dried fish wrapped in leaves, herbs that smelled of the earth after rain. He moved through the shelter like he was part of it, his steps light but sure, his hands always working, mending a rope, smoothing wood, tending the fire. When she cried at night, silent tears soaking the hides, he didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty words. But the next morning, a carved figure appeared by her bed, a mother holding a child, small and smooth, its lines simple but alive. No words, just a gift, left like a promise he didn't need to speak. She ran her fingers over it, tracing the curve of the mother's arms, and felt something shift inside her, a crack letting light through. One night, when the fire was low and the shelter felt smaller, warmer, she spoke. "I'm Lillian," she said, her voice steady, like she was claiming the name for the first time. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers, like he'd always known her but was waiting for her to say it. She looked at the baby, asleep in her arms. "Her name's Rose," she whispered, thinking of spring, of green fields and hope that didn't fade. Tala watched Rose kick at her blanket, her tiny hands reaching for nothing. "She'll have strong hands," he said, his voice soft but certain. Lillian blinked, caught off guard. "Why do you say that?" "You hold her like you're carrying the world," he said, his eyes steady, seeing something she couldn't. She didn't answer, but his words sank deep, like roots finding water, holding her to the earth. Her body healed, slow but stubborn, like a tree growing through cracked stone. The ache in her side dulled, her steps grew surer, though she tired quickly, her strength a flickering thing. She helped with small tasks, grinding herbs with a smooth stone, folding cloth he'd left by the fire, sewing patches on blankets worn thin by time. They moved around each other, not touching, but close like two rivers running side by side, sharing the same valley, but keeping their own paths. She watched him work, his hands wide and sure, smoothing wood into shapes that felt alive, tightening ropes with a rhythm that calmed her. He sang sometimes, soft melodies in a language she didn't know, rising like wind through canyon walls, carrying grief and memory in their notes. She didn't ask what they meant, she felt them, and that was enough. One afternoon, as she mended a torn shirt with thread he'd given her, she looked up, the firelight soft on her face. "You don't ask where I came from," she said, her voice quiet but curious. He was tending the fire, back turned, stirring the coals with a stick. He paused, then sat, his movements slow, deliberate. "You'll tell me," he said, "if it matters." She laughed, soft, tired, the sound surprising her. "It matters," she said, and paused, the words heavy on her tongue. Then she spoke, slow at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. She told him about the cabin, its walls closing in, the birth that tore her open, Mary's cold voice cutting deeper than any knife, Samuel's silence heavier than any shout. She told him about the bread left by the door, a cruel goodbye, and the snow that tried to bury her, step by step. She told him how they'd called her a failure, how they'd looked at Rose like a mistake, a burden wrapped in flesh. Her voice shook, but she didn't cry. She'd spent all her tears in the storm. Tala listened, firelight flickering on his face, his eyes steady, taking in every word without fixing, without judging, just hearing her in a way no one ever had. When she finished, her hands trembling, she whispered, "I thought I'd die out there. Part of me did." "You didn't," he said, his voice simple, true, like a stone dropped into still water. "No," she said, staring at the fire, its glow warming her face. "But I don't know who I am now." He reached into the flames, pulling out a smooth river stone, warm from the heat, its surface polished by years of water. He placed it in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "You're becoming," he said, the words small but heavy, like a seed carrying a forest inside it. She held the stone, its warmth spreading through her, and felt a door inside her creak open, just a little, letting in light she hadn't seen in years. That night, she sang to Rose, not her mother's songs about summer fields, but a new one she made up about stars and rivers, about a man who carried light in his silence, and a child who'd grow strong as the earth. Tala sat outside, sharpening a blade, the scrape of stone against metal steady, but she knew he heard. The fire burned bright, and for the first time, she felt like she was breathing air that belonged to her, not borrowed, not stolen. Spring came, slow and shy, like a child learning to trust. Snow melted, leaving patches of earth like wounds healing over, dark and damp. Trees budded in secret, their tips green against the gray, and birds returned, their songs sharp and hopeful in the quiet dawn. Lillian grew stronger, her voice no longer cracking, her steps no longer shaking. She walked farther each day, carrying Rose, showing her the world waking up, grasses pushing through soil, streams gurgling under thinning ice. She carved a wooden figure, awkward and simple, a woman standing tall, her hands open to the sky. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and she set it by Rose's bed, a quiet promise. Rose grew too, her eyes bright as river stones, her laugh like a bell ringing across the prairie. Tala called her Little Hawk, lifting her high until she giggled, her arms flapping like wings. Lillian watched them, her heart full, unsure what to call this life. Not home yet, but something close, something warm like a fire you could sit by without burning. One evening, under a sky scattered with stars like seeds tossed across a field, she stood outside, Rose bundled in her arms, the air cool but soft. Tala joined her, silent as always, his presence steady beside her. "Do you believe in second lives?" she asked, the words slipping out, soft as a breath. He tilted his head, his braid catching the starlight. "Not second," he said, just continued. She nodded, holding his words like a quilt, warm and patchwork, pieced together from quiet moments. The fire glowed behind them, its light spilling through the open door, and she felt something settle, not loud, but real, like snow falling soft, like a promise no one had to speak to understand. But the world beyond their shelter didn't forget, didn't let go. It waited, patient and watchful, just beyond the edge of the known, like a wolf pacing the tree line. At first, the signs were so small they could have been imagined. A hush in the birdsong too early in the morning, a shift in the way the wind moved through the trees, carrying with it a scent that didn't belong. Then came the footprint. Tala found it near the creek, where the soil stayed soft and damp, hidden beneath a curtain of overgrown brush. He had been gathering pine resin, his satchel half full, when he noticed the mark, one single, heavy step pressed deep into the mud. Too deep. The edges were sharp and unnatural, like something cut rather than stepped, the tread unfamiliar. Not theirs. Not a wandering deer or bear. Not an animal at all. He crouched down slowly, quiet as the breeze, and studied it for a long time. His fingers hovered just above the indent, not touching it, as if contact might make it more real, might make it something he couldn't unsee. The forest around him, once a place of comfort and solitude, suddenly felt closer, as if it had drawn a breath and was holding it. Watching him, when he returned to the cabin, his movements had changed. They were still careful, still measured, but slower, more cautious. His boots scuffed the ground with less certainty. His eyes scanned the tree-line more often, flickering toward the horizon even when he spoke. He sharpened his knife twice that evening, even though it didn't need it. Lillian noticed it all. She always did. She watched him from the porch, arms wrapped around Rose's small sleeping form, while Tala moved through his tasks like a man trying not to disturb Stillwater. There was a tension in him now, coiled and silent, like a bowstring pulled just before the arrow flies. He'd pause in the middle of fixing the roof, hammer in hand, eyes lost somewhere beyond the trees. When he chopped firewood, his strikes were harder, deeper, splitting the logs clean through in one blow, like he needed to hear the sound echo through the forest, like he was warning something or someone. One morning, with the sun barely rising and mist still curled like smoke across the clearing, Lillian asked, her voice low and even, careful not to wake Rose who slept warm against her chest. "Are you worried?" Tala didn't answer right away. He was staring into the fire, the flames painting his face in restless light. His hands were still, resting on his knees, but his shoulders were drawn tight, like a man listening for thunder on a clear day. "Not yet," he said finally. The words were simple, but they felt heavy, leaden, pulled from somewhere deep. His voice was taut, like rope weathered and stretched too far, fraying at the edges. Lillian didn't reply. She didn't have to, because she felt it too, the shift in the wind, the weight in the air. Something had changed. The forest didn't feel like theirs anymore. It felt borrowed, and something was coming to collect. Days later, a letter came. A boy, young and nervous, rode up on a thin horse, his hands clutching a sealed envelope. "It's for Lillian Hart," he said, his eyes wide, nodding toward the hills. "From white folks at the trading post." Her name hit her like a stone, foreign, like it belonged to a woman she'd buried in the snow. She took the letter, her fingers cold, and opened it, the paper crackling in her hands. She read it once, then again, each word a spark in dry grass. Samuel had remarried, a woman younger, sharper, meant to replace her. Mary was sick, her strength fading, the house falling into chaos. They didn't apologize, didn't beg, but they wrote, "You may return. We'll take the child if you don't want her raised on savage land." The words burned, sharp as a blade, cutting deeper than the cold ever had. They'd cast her out, left her and Rose to die, and now they wanted her daughter like she was a thing to be claimed, a trophy to polish their pride. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She walked to the fire, her steps steady, and burned the letter, watching the paper curl into ash, each word dissolving into nothing. She burned their names, their claim, their power over her, until only embers remained. Tala stood beside her, silent, his presence a wall against the world. "They never knew her name," she said, her voice steady, clear. "Their loss," he said. And she believed him, the words sinking into her like truth carved in stone. Spring deepened, the prairie blooming in bursts of color. Purple flowers by the creek, yellow grasses swaying in the wind. Rose ran through the fields, chasing butterflies, her steps bold, her laughter louder each day. Lillian planted a garden, beans climbing poles she'd cut herself, squash blooming bright, pumpkins swelling under wide leaves. She taught Rose to touch the soil gently, to whisper to the plants like friends, her small hands patting the earth. Tala carved her a whistle shaped like a bird, its notes soft but clear, as she carried it everywhere, blowing it until the shelter rang with her joy. Lillian smiled, her heart lighter, watching Rose grow, watching the world grow with her. They lived, not in hiding, but in the open, not loud, but full, like a song finding its rhythm after years of silence. Lillian sewed by the fire, piecing together a shawl from scraps she'd found in chests. Bits of cloth, faded but strong, each one holding a memory she couldn't name. She stitched them with care, her hands steady, her mind quiet. Tala watched sometimes, not speaking, but his eyes soft, like he saw the story she was weaving. He told her once about his sister, who'd woven songs into cloth, her hands dancing over a loom that stood covered in the corner. "She'd have liked you," he said, and Lillian held the words close, like a gift she hadn't earned. But peace, she learned, was a fragile thing, easily cracked. One evening, as the fire burned low and Rose slept, Lillian sat with her shawl, the needle pausing in her hand. "Why do you stay here?" she asked Tala, her voice soft, curious. "This land, it's so far from everything." He looked at the fire, his hand still, a rare thing. "This land knows me," he said. "It remembers, even when I don't." He paused, then spoke again, slower, like pulling a root from deep soil. "I fought once, far from here. Came back with nothing but scars. This place, it gave me a name again." She nodded, not asking more, but feeling the weight of his words, the shape of a life he didn't often share. She told him about her own past then, haltingly, about the farm back east, her mother's laugh, her father's hands worn from plow and prayer, the days Samuel had promised her a future that turned to ash. She didn't cry, but her voice wavered, like a leaf holding on in a storm. He listened, as always, without fixing, without turning away, and she felt seen, not as a failure, but as someone still growing. Until the rider came. It was dusk, the fire just lit, the air thick with cedar and the promise of night. Lillian was braiding Rose's hair, humming a tune she barely remembered, when hooves pounded outside, fast and careless, shaking the earth. She froze, her heart tight, her hands still in Rose's curls. Tala was outside, sharpening a blade, but he stood, his movements calm but sharp, like a hawk sighting prey. A man dismounted, pale, his coat dusty, boots scuffed from hard travel. His eyes scanned the homestead, sharp, like he was measuring it for sale. "You Lillian Hart?" he asked, his voice rough, drawling. She stepped out, Rose behind her, clutching the whistle. "Who's asking?" Tala moved closer, his presence solid, unyielding. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice low, steady. The man smirked, looking Tala over with thinly veiled disdain. "I'm here for Samuel Hart," he said, pulling a folded letter from his coat. "Says his wife went astray. Wants his daughter back." Lillian's heart didn't race. It stilled, heavy as stone, cold as the snow she'd walked through. "She's not his," she said, stepping forward, her voice clear, unbroken. He gave her nothing but a name he didn't earn. "Blood's blood," the man said, his hand resting near his gun, fingers twitching. "No," Lillian said, her eyes hard, her voice rising like a river, breaking free. "A mother's more than birth. A father's more than a claim. I carried her through a blizzard, fed her when I had nothing, held her through fever, sang her to sleep. I taught her to walk, to laugh, to whistle that bird in her hand. What did he do? What did he ever give her but shame? The man blinked, caught off guard, his smirk faltering. Tala stood beside her, silent, his stance saying everything. You will not take what isn't yours. The rider's hand hovered near his gun, but he saw something in them. A woman who wouldn't bend, a man who wouldn't break, a family forged in fire, not blood. He let out a breath, muttering, Guess she ain't worth the trouble. He spat into the dirt, tucked the letter back into his coat, and mounted his horse, riding off, dust trailing like a fading threat, the hoofbeats swallowed by the night. Lillian stood still, her hands trembling just a little, her breath shallow. Tala's hand touched her back, light, steady, grounding her like an anchor in a storm. They walked inside, the fire warm, Rose already asleep, curled by the hearth, her whistle clutched tight in her tiny fist. Lillian sat with her shawl, adding a new thread, red as fire, strong as courage, her needle moving with purpose. Tala handed her a strip of leather to bind it, his fingers brushing hers, warm and sure. She didn't pull away, didn't need to. The touch was enough, a quiet promise shared in silence. Later, under a sky bright with stars, the air cool and sharp with the scent of grass, she looked at him, her voice soft but clear. Can a place have a name, even if no one writes it down? Yes, he said, meeting her eyes, holding them longer than ever, like he was seeing her soul and giving his in return. Hope, she smiled, the word settling deep, rooting her to the earth, to him, to Rose. At dawn, she carried Rose outside, the sky golden pink, streaked with clouds like feathers. The garden was alive, beans climbing, squash blooming, pumpkins round and heavy. She knelt and planted a wooden marker in the soil, carved with her own hands. The words simple but true, home. Tala stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, warm, steady, a tether she'd choose every day. They turned back, the door open, the fire waiting. The world theirs built not from promises spoken, but from moments shared, from silences that held more than words ever could. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel hope, strength, or the warmth of a home found against all odds, hit that subscribe button. There's more waiting, stories of courage, of building something real, of finding light in the darkest storms. Join us for the next one, and let's keep weaving these tales together.